Jonathan, is this a betrayal of the Brexiteers?
I mean, I think using words like betrayal are kind of...
Yeah, editor of BrexitCentral, obviously, Jonathan. Sorry, go ahead.
Indeed. I think using words like betrayal and other words are very emotionally loaded words, not hugely helpful in the scheme of things. But I think you've got to look at the people who rebelled last night and ask why really did they need to do it? Because as Ali just said to you, the government had explained in a written statement yesterday morning in black and white the number of times in which MPs are going to get votes on the Brexit deal that is going to be put before the House of Commons before it is all agreed. There'll be primary legislation, so there's plenty of opportunities to look at the final deal and reject it or not, as the case may be. But what last night and this morning, looking at my Twitter feed, as I'm sure you do too, a lot of the people, in fact the people who were most excited about the government defeat last night were people like Lord Adonis, for example, who basically said this is the first step to reversing Brexit. And I think a lot of people look at what happened last night, seeing that the government had made a whole load of promises about votes on the deal, as to what were these people's real motivations, because every single person who rebelled on that issue last night from the Tory benches were people who had voted Remain, a lot of whom very publicly are very upset with that result, but it was a result decided by the biggest ever electoral mandate in British history.
Come on, Jonathan, it was a vote that was so close, so very, very close, and the complex arguments were not included in the question, that there are quite a few people in this country that can be feeling confused or can be feeling that they've not been recognised by this vote, don't you think?
I don't want to insult the intelligence of the British people who witnessed a campaign over a number of weeks and months.
During which some of them were lied to, during which they did not have it spelt out what the complexity of leaving the EU possibly was. Like, are we seriously saying that the people of this country knew how complex the Irish border question would be, for example? Did you see that being spelt out anywhere?
I don't think that any of the accusations you've just levelled about the referendum campaign are accusations that you could not level also at a normal general election or any kind of election campaign, frankly. And when we have elections in this country, you don't have people saying afterwards, oh, well, we don't accept the result. You have an election, you have a referendum, and you have to accept the result, win or lose. And that's what's happened. And a lot of people last night who voted for that amendment made very high-minded speeches in the House of Commons about their passionate desire to stand up for parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary accountability, and parliamentary scrutiny. Well, I would say to them, where were you these last 40 years when year after year after year the European Union has given down on tablets of stone directives, regulations, laws from Brussels that unelected bureaucrats have foisted upon this country without a jot of parliamentary scrutiny?
Anushka?
Hello.
How do you react to that?
Well, I mean, I think he's conflating two different things. I mean, on the one hand, is it true that the referendum campaign didn't go into all the detail? I agree with you on that. It clearly didn't, on both sides of the campaign, actually. We didn't hear details about the Irish border. We certainly didn't hear the words regulatory alignment or divergence. In fact, I went back to the Vote, Leave and Remain campaigns websites the other day to see if this issue was even mentioned. It wasn't. That said, there was this huge vote and people did vote for Brexit, and the government is meaning to deliver it. I think there's almost a little bit of hysteria around the vote last night. It is true that it seemed to show a majority potentially for people who want a softer form of Brexit. And, Jonathan may be right that within that there may be some people who actually want to reverse the vote. But it wasn't about whether or not we're going to get Brexit or not. It was about a vote at the end of the process, which, by the way, isn't going to be able to stop Brexit, even if it is a vote against. It just put into the legislation the fact that that vote would happen before the government could then enact the legislation that follows it.
So help me understand then. So if it is a vote against, what happens?
Well, this is the difficult situation in which you're in, because as I think Chris was pointing out earlier, a lot of the people who were pushing for that vote last night are essentially people who would prefer a softer form of Brexit. So the last thing they would want would be to vote against and for that to result in us crashing out on World Trade Organization rules and not having a trade deal, yeah? But so what would we do in that situation? Because we can't necessarily go back to the table and renegotiate. You might be looking, for example, at trying to delay Article 50, and that's what makes people like Jonathan understandably worried about the motivation. But what Dominic Grieve or Anna Soubry, those Tory rebels, would probably argue in that situation is it gives Parliament the opportunity through legislation to scrutinise what is going to happen line by line and eventually have a vote.
Is that your understanding, Chris, that a vote against would not affect Brexit?
Picking up on what Anushka was saying, my understanding, and we'll bring Jonathan in on this as well, because I'd be intrigued to hear your reaction and understanding, Jonathan, on this, is that because Brexit is going to happen come what may, in terms of the countdown clock is ticking, as we constantly hear, the vote is going to be around a deal or a no deal, and in other words, whether the Parliament endorses the deal that the government comes back with or not, which some are making the argument might incline those who were the rebels last night, say on the Conservative side, who tend to be, as you say, sceptical about Brexit or keen on a softer Brexit, to endorse a deal, even if it's not quite one that they would have wanted themselves. Jonathan, what's your take on this? Do you fear that this potentially jeopardises Brexit, or at least jeopardises the kind of Brexit you'd like to see?
I mean, I think there are some people who have this notion that you have a vote at the end of the day where you accept the deal the government's agreed, or if you don't, you magically somehow return to being in the EU as if nothing's happened, which clearly cannot be the case, because Article 50 was triggered by a very majority of MPs.
Yeah, but who's saying that would be the case?
Well, I get the notion that no one said it in terms, but the view of a lot of the arch continuity remainers is that we need to stay in the European Union, or at least in the single market and the customs union, which, as far as most Brexiteers is concerned, is akin to being in the European Union. And by the way, the Vote Leave referendum campaign was utterly clear that a vote to leave was coming out of the single market, was coming out of the customs union, because unless you do so, you can't have control over your borders, over your laws, over your own trade policy to make those new trade agreements around the world.
But given that the process of extending the whole business of the Article 50 process would require the approval of all of the other member states and all the rest of it, surely in reality that vote is going to be take this deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated or no deal. In other words, Brexit is happening regardless, it's just the deal or not.
Yes, I agree with you, and in that sense it's ironic that if the kind of anti-Brexit forces are thinking about trying to vote down a deal, they would be the ones creating the chaos that they claim to want to avoid.
So from your perspective then, Jonathan, have you anything to worry about as far as last night's concerned?
I mean, I think last night it was a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. I think it's, from my perspective, I think the worst thing about it is that it handed this propaganda victory to the anti-Brexit forces overnight. But the government obviously can still potentially amend the bill yet further at report stage, and Andrea Leadsom, the Leader of the House, announced this morning that that's going to take place over report stage and third reading over 2 days in the middle of January. So there could be further amendments down the line, and I dare say the government has behaved very responsibly during the course of this bill. They accepted an amendment to create a sifting committee so that MPs will look at changes to law that ministers want to make and decide which need to go before a full vote of the House of Commons and which ministers can do without recourse to the Commons. But and that's a reminder that a lot of this bill, pretty much all this bill, is very much procedural. It's not policy. It's about just ensuring that we've got a tidy statute book at the end of the day, but on the day before Brexit happens. Mm-hmm. And therefore getting it through is in the interest of everybody, because